June 15, 1904. More than 1,300 people, almost all of them women and children, are standing on the wooden decks of a steamboat in New York's East River, singing hymns. In 30 minutes, over 1,000 of them will be dead. The fire itself was an accident. Everything that happened after the fire was not, and almost no one was ever punished for it. The neighborhood was called Kleindeutschland, Little Germany. It filled the streets east of the Bowery, and by 1904 it was one of the largest German-speaking communities on earth outside of Berlin and Vienna. German bakeries, German newspapers, German beer halls, and on East 6th Street, St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church. Every June, St. Mark's chartered a steamboat for its Sunday school picnic. In 1904, it was the 17th annual excursion, and the destination was Locust Grove, a picnic ground at Eaton's Neck on Long Island. Families saved for it all year. Women bought new dresses. Children were promised ice cream. Because it was a Wednesday, most of the fathers were at work. That single scheduling detail decided who lived and who died. The passenger list was overwhelmingly mothers, grandmothers, and children under 12. The boat was the General Slocum, built in Brooklyn in 1891, and named after a Union Civil War general. She was a side-wheel excursion steamer, roughly 235 feet long, about 72 meters, with 3 towering wooden decks painted brilliant white. She was licensed to carry 500 people. She was, by the standards of the day, a respectable vessel, not new, not luxurious, but certified, inspected, and trusted. Her captain was William Van Schaik, 67 years old, with more than 40 years on the water. The Knickerbocker Steamship Company advertised that he had carried some 30 million passengers without a single fatality. On the morning of June 15th, that record was still intact. At around 9:30, the Slocum pulled away from the 3rd Street Pier with an estimated 342 people aboard. A hired band played on the promenade deck. Children ran the stairs between levels. From the shore, families waved, but directly beneath their feet, in a small compartment forward of the main deck, sat a room that would decide the entire day. The lamp room. It held oil lamps, oily rags, and packed straw used for stowing glassware, and every piece of equipment aboard that ship designed to save a life in that situation, the hoses, the lifeboats, the life preservers, had been formally certified as sound roughly 6 weeks earlier by a federal inspector who spent very little time looking at any of it. Keep that inspection in mind. It comes back at the end of this story, and it is the reason the number is over 1,000. Understand what a wooden excursion steamer actually was in 1904. 3 decks of dry pine, layer after layer of oil-based paint, some of it applied annually for over a decade. Varnished railings, canvas awnings. The Slocum wasn't a ship carrying flammable cargo. The Slocum was the flammable cargo, which is why the law required fire equipment. And here is where the chain begins. Link 1, the hoses. The Slocum carried linen fire hose. Linen rots. It rots faster in salt air, and faster still when it is never unrolled. Crew testimony later indicated the hose had hung in place, untested for years. It looked perfect, rolled tight, painted brackets, exactly what an inspector wants to see from 6 feet away. At this point, the disaster was still entirely avoidable. But then came Link 2. Link 2, the lifeboats, 6 lifeboats. They had been wired to their brackets and painted over so many times that the paint itself had effectively glued them to the ship. They could not be lowered by hand. On the morning of June 15th, not one of them was launched. Not one. Link 3, the life preservers. More than 3,000 cork life jackets hung in racks overhead, most of them manufactured in 1891, the same year the ship was built. 13 years of humidity, heat, and salt had turned the cork inside them into something that was no longer cork. I'll tell you exactly what investigators found inside those jackets later, because it is genuinely the worst detail in this entire story. And it explains why so many bodies were recovered floating face down. Link 4. The crew. The Slocum carried around 30 crewmen. Most were seasonal hires, deckhands, waiters, musicians. Federal regulation required fire drills. Testimony after the disaster indicated the crew had never performed a meaningful one. Many did not know where equipment was stored. Some had been aboard for only weeks. Link 5. The inspection. In May 1904, a federal inspector named Henry Lundberg from the United States Steamboat Inspection Service examined the General Slocum and certified her equipment as compliant. The hoses, the boats, the preservers, all approved. That signature is the load-bearing beam of this entire tragedy. Remove it, and the Slocum does not sail. So at 9:30 in the morning, a wooden ship packed with over 1,300 people carrying rotted hose, sealed lifeboats, and decorative life jackets steamed north up the East River into one of the narrowest, fastest, most treacherous tidal channels in the United States. Somewhere in the first 30 minutes of that voyage, a fire started in the lamp room. The official cause was never conclusively determined. The most widely accepted explanation is a discarded match or cigarette igniting the straw packing. By multiple accounts, a boy noticed smoke early and tried to warn the crew. He was reportedly waved off. That claim was disputed afterward and never fully resolved. But what is not disputed is the timeline. By the time the fire was formally reported to the bridge, shortly before 10 o'clock, it had already eaten through the forward compartment and reached the paint locker. A crew member opened the lamp room door to look. Fresh air hit the fire. It went from a smoldering, contained blaze to an inferno in seconds. And then Captain Van Schaik made the decision that turned a shipboard fire into the deadliest day in New York City's history. He did not stop. The nearest shoreline was minutes away, the Bronx waterfront at around 134th Street. But that stretch held lumber yards and oil storage tanks, and Van Schaik later said he feared driving a burning ship into them. Instead, he ordered full speed ahead for North Brother Island, roughly a mile further upriver. The Slocum was already doing significant speed. Now she accelerated into a headwind with an open fire in her bow. Imagine standing on that deck. The ship is burning in front of you, and instead of slowing down, the engines get louder. The wind on your face gets stronger. Every knot of speed the captain adds is feeding the fire that is coming toward you. That decision took perhaps 90 seconds to make. It cost roughly 1,000 lives. The fire moved aft along the wooden decks like it was following a fuse. Passengers ran to the stern. The band stopped playing. Mothers pulled life jackets down from the overhead racks and tied them onto their children first. And this is where the equipment failure becomes unbearable. The cork inside the 1891 preservers had disintegrated into powder. A jacket that had been buoyant when it was manufactured now behaved like a sandbag. Witnesses on shore and in nearby boats described watching children be thrown into the water wearing life preservers and watching them go straight down. Remember the core of this. Over 1,000 people died wearing safety equipment that a federal inspector had signed off on 6 weeks earlier. Crewmen finally reached the hoses. When the pressure came on, the rotted linen split open. The water went sideways instead of forward. Most of the passengers could not swim. Swimming was not something respectable women of that era were taught, and they were dressed for a church picnic. Long, heavy wool skirts, layered petticoats, high boots. In the water, those clothes absorbed weight instantly. The Slocum reached North Brother Island around 10:15. Van Schaik drove her aground, but the bow struck first, in water still well over a person's head, and the stern, where nearly everyone had gathered, remained in deep water. Then the upper deck collapsed. Hundreds of people fell into the fire below. Hundreds more jumped. The tidal current at that point in the river runs hard, and it carried people away from the hull faster than boats could reach them. What happened next was the only decent part of the day. The tugboat Wade drove in close enough to the burning hull that her own paint blistered, and her crew pulled survivors aboard. Other tugs, launches, and a fireboat converged. On North Brother Island, the staff of Riverside Hospital, a quarantine facility for contagious disease, ran into the water fully clothed. Nurses, orderlies, and even patients formed human chains into the current, hauling people out. Several rescuers nearly drowned doing it. They saved dozens. But the water around North Brother Island filled with bodies faster than anyone could count them. The final figure was 021 dead. Roughly 321 survived. It remained the deadliest single day in New York City's history for 97 years, until September 11, 2001. The bodies were laid out on the pier at East 26th Street. Families walked the rows. Entire households were erased in a single morning. One family lost 6 members, another lost every child. President Theodore Roosevelt ordered a federal commission of investigation. A New York grand jury convened, and what the investigators found was not a mystery. It was an inventory. The hoses, rotted, and by all indications never tested. The lifeboats, wired and painted immovably in place. The fire drills, not performed. And the life preservers. Here's the payoff I promised you. Investigators cut the jackets open. The cork inside had degraded into dust, which was damning enough. But in a number of the preservers, they found something else sewn into the fabric. Iron bars. Life preservers were required to meet a minimum weight standard. Cork loses mass as it dries and crumbles. So metal had been added to bring the jackets up to legal weight, meaning the equipment didn't merely fail to float. Some of it was engineered at the factory to pass a scale test rather than to save a human being. That is the real cause of the General Slocum disaster. Not a match, not a captain's error alone. A regulatory system that inspected paperwork instead of equipment, and a supply chain that had learned exactly which test the inspector would actually perform. And now, the part your title asked about. 8 people were indicted, including the captain, company officials of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company, and the inspector who had certified the ship. The charges against the inspector did not stick. The company's officers were not convicted. Knickerbocker itself, the corporation that owned, maintained, and profited from the Slocum, escaped with a financial penalty. One man went to prison, Captain William Van Schaik. In January 1906, he was convicted of criminal negligence, specifically for failing to maintain fire drills and fire equipment, and sentenced to 10 years at Sing Sing. He was 69 years old and partially blinded by the fire. He was paroled in 1911 after roughly 3.5 years behind bars. In 1912, President William Howard Taft granted him a full pardon, so the arithmetic of accountability for 21 deaths comes out to this: 3.5 years served by one elderly man, later erased by presidential pardon. The inspector who signed the certificate, the company that owned the rotting equipment, and the manufacturer who sewed iron into life jackets, none of them spent a day in a cell. The public fury did produce something. The Roosevelt Commission found the Steamboat Inspection Service fundamentally negligent, and officials were removed. Inspection procedures were rewritten, standards for life preservers were tightened, and the cork and canvas designs of the 19th century began their long march toward the sealed, tested, dated equipment we use now. Requirements for fire drills, functional hoses, and accessible lifeboats were enforced with a seriousness that had simply not existed before June 15, 1904. Every time you step onto a ferry and see a life jacket in a sealed locker with a stamped inspection date, every time a crew member reads a safety announcement nobody appears to be listening to, you are looking at the residue of this fire. Those rules were written in response to what people found floating near North Brother Island. Kleindeutschland did not recover. The neighborhood had lost its mothers and its children in a single morning. Survivors moved north to Yorkville, rather than live among the empty apartments. Within a generation, Little Germany as a community had effectively ceased to exist. A marble memorial fountain still stands in Tompkins Square Park, engraved with the faces of 2 children. In Middle Village, Queens, a monument marks the mass grave of the unidentified. The Slocum's hull was salvaged and rebuilt as a coal barge named the Maryland. In 1911, she sank in a storm off the New Jersey coast. The last survivor was Adela Wotherspoon. She had been 6 months old on the deck that morning, carried off the burning ship while her 2 sisters died. She lived to be 100 and died in January 2004, 99 years, 7 months after the fire. 1,021 people drowned inside safety equipment. It had been inspected. It had been certified. It had been approved by the government of the United States. And the only thing wrong with it was that nobody had ever bothered to open it up and look inside. Next time, another disaster built out of a detail almost too small to notice, right up until the moment it wasn't. Subscribe if you want to see it.